What a week. What a fucking week. I voted for the first time since the second Bush election.
Wow.
That's a long time. That was back when I had a six-pack and told people I was straight. But I've been dicked down a lot since then. Voting, not so much. But, you know, because yes, as a radical activist, right, I'm not going to be going ahead and voting and manufacturing consent for these institutions that are trying to kill us and pretend that they're ever going to be doing anything else besides trying to kill us. But then with like this Trump administration, they got a little too excited and comfortable with trying to kill us. And I was like, maybe I should just do everything I can. I watched the election results. That's later on tonight with my boyfriend. I watched the election results. It was great reality TV. It had the drama, the tension, the disappointment. Beto O'Rourke broke hearts across the country when he lost in a tense neck-and-neck race for the Senate, forcing us to have to look at Ted Cruz's creepy fucking claymation face for 6 more fucking years. Right. He looks that I want to popularize that theory. Ted Cruz is the Zodiac killer. This is not slanderous. It's actually true. It's a factually based claim I'm making on my research. But, you know, don't feel bad for Beto O'Rourke. He is, however, entitled to the second place prize in the Senate race, which is me sucking his Beto until it O'Rourke's all over my face. So I hope he comes to claim that prize. No, I'm just kidding. I do not blow electoral politics D. I only blow radical D. And when I'm drunk, any big D. Oh yeah, what a week. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the notorious RGB, fell at court and cracked 3 ribs.
Oh my God.
Someone pushed her. We all know it was Kavanaugh. That is what he does. He assaults women. Well, I got a message for you, Brett fucking Kavanaugh. Don't you dare bring your puffy face to the southeast side of Chicago. That's kind of like pretty much fucking Indiana, because the woman here will fuck you up. That's right. Tonight's episode is entitled Environmental Revolution and the Momme Fatales of South Chicago. Olga Bautista, Jade Mazzone, Kat West, and Kay Koval will be our featured guests. We'll get the breakdown in environmental injustice and transnational capitalism on South Chicago with Angela Tovar and GINA RAMIREZ. But keep your heads on, because before we get to all that and transform you, we'll inform you with Hoodoisie Tea Time. In the past month, the Trump administration has been engaged in an ongoing campaign of misinformation and scaremongering about the migrant caravan, asserting that it's full of criminals, including unknown Middle Easterners who pose a threat to Americans. We know that this was a strategy intended to rile up Trump's base of xenophobes and white supremacists before the midterm elections, and we know that it worked. 2 weeks ago, one of those white supremacists made a post on the social media site Gab about a Jewish organization which provides services to refugees. He wrote that the group likes to bring invaders to kill our people. That's a direct quote. He then opened fire on a Saturday morning service at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. The timing of this shooting is no coincidence. So I guess my question for us to get us started is, so what do you all make of this intersection of anti-Semitism and xenophobia, and what opportunities do you see this fight, do you see to fight this threat as a united front between movements?
Here's a sentence that I never thought I'd be able to use in public, but I was just having a conversation with a friend of mine, good friend of mine, who's a former skinhead. And his name is Christian Picciolini, and over the years he's been on my show talking about these things, whether it was the Dylan Roofs of the world, or whether it was this political environment that we exist in. He's been talking about this point in time where things like this are starting to unfortunately become the norm. And he was telling me that what we're seeing happening right now isn't a coincidence. It's part of what some white supremacists and white nationalists and neo-Nazis and skinheads refer to as mainstreaming. And what that is essentially co-opting regular white America and their values and their aesthetics, so that way some of the more radical views of the extreme right are hidden and more consumable to regular folks, regular everyday folks, regular disillusioned individuals like you, me, or college kids. And this is where we get the Steve Bannons, the Richard Spencers of the world, who don't have a hood on, who don't walk around carrying the tiki torches, but certainly use the rhetoric used to incite individuals like that to action.
I put myself in a funny situation because I like wrote this segment of the show, and I explicitly set myself up to talk about something that I'm like deeply uncomfortable with and deeply like unsure about as a Jewish woman and as someone who has done some organizing, specifically in Jewish organizing spaces around the occupation in Palestine. And growing up, I didn't think that anti-Semitism was a real thing. I thought that it kind of existed, but you know, I had white privilege. The Jews that I knew had white privilege. That was not the problem that I thought I needed to be addressing in my life. So finding myself in this moment where obviously I'm very confronted with the fact that anti-Semitism is real as fuck, and trying to figure out what is my role in that has been really confusing for me. I've been kind of at a loss, and I've been very inspired by someone who's actually in this room. His name is Isaac Brazelau. Give it up for Isaac. He's a public historian of radical Jewishness, I would say, and he just is studying kind of the precedent of Jewish solidarity with other radical movements. I think I didn't always used to know that was a possibility, that there was a history there, because what I am familiar with is the Jewish establishment only acknowledging anti-Semitism where they believe they see it in the BDS movement or in other movements against Israel, and not agreeing with that and kind of being like, well, is there any hope to combat the anti-Semitism that I believe is real and that I believe poses a threat not just to me but to everybody, as we're seeing with the kind of confluence of anti-Semitic thought and anti-immigrant thought and all these other forms of hatred. And so the only thing that I kind of see right now as a way forward is really studying the history.
The idea of when we talk about these things, and especially we're in a table, we're at a table up here, we're in this like room full of people of color, it makes it seem like it's just some crazy shit that went down in Pittsburgh. It makes it seem that it's like kind of like some faraway anti-Semitism, that our closest, biggest historical reference is the Holocaust that was 70 years ago now. And so I think like one of the things to like really think about though, like, is that's not the case. 26% of voters in the 3rd Congressional District, so that's like Bridgeport, Mount Greenwood, Southwest suburbs, voted for an actual motherfucking Nazi. And I think a lot of it points to the failures of capitalism. Yeah. And that now that capitalism is literally collapsing and it cannot accommodate everyone, what we're seeing is the preparation for that.
I'm Isaac. Ellen gave me like such a crazy introduction.
All right, get over yourself. Let's keep it going. It's a conversation. Yeah.
But I want to say that as far as like the connection back to, we're like used to talking about capitalism in crisis and like the Holocaust, right? Because it's this moment of industrial capitalism really taking the energy and the destructive forces that were going on in all of the global south, of all these colonial countries, and Germany, which didn't have the colonial stature, was colonizing people, but not to the degree in the way of like Britain and France, and then refracting it, taking it into Europe, right, within itself. In many ways, probably more inspired by America than America's maybe inspired by Nazism now. And so the way that we sort of imagine ourselves as going down the path of we're becoming like Nazism is like, we did that 300 years ago. Europe wanted to unify and have, this sort of like collaborationist class that we basically have in this country, many descendants of, from down the line of the Pilgrims. And if you want to trace that back to the idea of colonialism, right, coming in who was the regime, right, of Spain that did colonization? They also committed the Inquisition, right? Anti-Jewish violence is at the root of coloniality. It's at and like that was then transformed through industrial capital. This is a problem, that used to be called the Jewish question. The persistence of anti-Semitism, the persistence of anti-Jewish violence and systems of oppression. We're seeing the continuation and the acceleration of these processes, so we're seeing new frontiers. I mean, for my generation, Ellen's generation, other folks here who grew up with privileges, Jews it's not so much that we're seeing it ripped away as we're seeing a type of violence returns, where I can have my grandmother sending me an email she's bougie, she's never experienced any type of real oppression. I mean, she didn't even...
I want to hang out with her.
Yeah. But she sent me an email right after Pittsburgh saying, you've never experienced anti-Semitism in your life, you will. And a lot of people are getting messages like that in our community, and it's not because of like anything made up. I mean, I'm a Hebrew school teacher. I had to teach Hebrew school the very fucking next day. And I also want to say that like, as we respond to this, it's not just about, on the one hand, looking at, this solidarity that we do need to have. Like, that's one real aspect. Like, there's Jews in the West Coast who are protesting outside of ICE, right? Who are also connecting this to the black people murdered at the Kroger grocery store, connecting it to, like, Dylan Roof, perfect example, right? The violence that people of color feel every day in this country, like, and showing up for it, that's a very important part of the equation. I think the other part of the equation is looking at how Jewish people are systematically oppressed in this country, because Trump was saying the same shit as Robert Bowers, the white nationalist. In a matter of days after the shooting, he was saying George Soros, this Jewish billionaire, is probably funding,
Right.
He's calling it the caravan, but we know it's people seeking asylum from Honduras, right? And that scared me probably more than Pittsburgh.
So, midterm elections just happened. Radicals have a very vexed relationship with voting, right? At one point, it's considered just these institutions that are only trying to kill us. Like I said earlier, at another, it's considered a form of harm reduction. Really quick before we move on, what are your thoughts on the midterm elections? Because I woke up and I don't feel saved.
I'll say this. A couple of weeks ago, I was at a ballot party at Yollocalli, talking to a bunch of youth from Little Village about their thoughts on voting. And I'll save my thoughts on voting, but I'll express what a lot of them shared. They were looking around the room talking about the candidates and what they felt were valuable tidbits to learn about each candidate. And ultimately, what they were saying is that they looked around the room and that they would vote because they needed to see a change happen for their brothers and sisters in their community. And if they didn't believe, then it's kind of like having no faith in anything. And what's the point of even existing if you don't feel like you can make a difference? So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about energy and how much energy gets invested in different kinds of political work. And I definitely am someone who, kind of adheres to the idea that voting is a valuable thing to do as harm reduction, as a way to kind of shape the battlefield that you're fighting in, but that it's not the main fight. And I think that's true, but then I'm clocking myself and I'm thinking about, okay, but how much energy did you just expend, in the run-up to this election, doing voter education, doing this stuff that I do think is valuable, but I'm wondering, am I recreating that energy in what I claim is the main fight?
So I think that Trump scared the shit out of people so bad that even Ricky voted. So I think that's pretty much like a litmus test of where we're at. It's that bad. I think also the fact that at some point in time, people fighting for the right to vote were radicals, right? So I think it's also thinking about what does it mean to be a radical? Like, we are fighting for what we believe is right, but that's also temporal and contemporary. Like, that's not how it's always been. So I don't believe voting is a solution for everything, but I do believe that if you don't vote and it can kill you.
For me, it's not just important to vote because of the side. I actually don't shame non-voters. I actually think that non-voting is a very healthy and very important way of political protest. Right, and then I think it's saying fuck this system, fuck this way of operating. These people will never operate in our interest, and I can respect and honor and get behind anybody that does that, even when I am making decisions. Even because not just because I held that, I will even hold that even when I'm making a decision that is not embodying that philosophy. All right, let's get started. So the two of you grew up in the same neighborhood and ended up doing the same kind of work in different places. So then how did you both come to this shit?
I really became interested in social justice at a young age in the 90s when there was this big heat wave in Chicago and so many people passed away, and growing up really poor, and I didn't have air conditioning during that heat wave. And I remember my parents taking us to malls and taking us to friends' houses so that we would survive that summer. And I was always curious as to why poor people were being punished. So that sort of sat through my whole entire life, and I decided a few years ago that I was going to go back to school for grad school for sociology. And I became pregnant while I was in grad school, and at the same time, the Petco crisis was happening in my neighborhood. And, I was poor and a grad student, and I knew I had to raise my son in this neighborhood. And so I decided to sort of change the narrative of my life and do whatever I can to provide a healthy, thriving community for my son.
My story is similar. I grew up here. How many people are from here or from this neighborhood? Can you just raise your hand? If you're from here, it's, and if you've been around for a while like I have, environmental justice is just a part of your life. And this neighborhood used to be a pathway to the middle class. You could come here, you could secure a union job, your family, black and brown people, could have a middle class lifestyle here, and that's still evident. If you come here and you look at the architecture, you're seeing suburban style, very basic, like suburban style architecture, right? That's like typical of Chicago neighborhoods. You could have a backyard, you could have a 2-car garage, you could have a full, like a finished basement. That was all something that was very accessible to people for a very long time here. That's changed. And so witnessing that transition right before your eyes, I think was really what led me to do this type of work. I thought about it though, and I didn't want to go into a profession where I wasn't part of the decision making, right? Like if you pursue planning, I went to grad school for urban planning, and I did an undergrad in urban studies, and when you do that, you learn that you're the expert and that you're gonna go into a community and you're gonna tell them what's gonna happen. And I wanted to really think about how to like deprofessionalize planning and how to take those tools and bring them back to the community.
So for people who don't know, can you explain a little bit about the history of the environmental justice movement on the Southeast side?
The Southeast Side Environmental Task Force is the longest running or grassroots organization here on the Southeast Side. And typically they have fought for protections against coal gasification plants and to restore natural areas, because this is a really diverse and beautiful landscape. We have a lot of marshes here. We have this special green parrot that I don't know what it is, but it's really loud. And it's just a really beautiful place to live. I live right across the street from Eggers Grove, a forest preserve. I mean, how many people can say that in the city of Chicago? So I think they've had some sort of social justice background, but I think the coalition to ban pet coke is really moving that agenda forward because it's so desperately needed in this neighborhood. We've been left behind for far too long.
And Gina, can you tell us what pet coke is and like what that situation is?
Yeah, so it's just a byproduct of the oil refining process. So we're right along the border of Indiana. So about 2 miles south of here is one of the largest oil refineries, BP Whiting. And so essentially all of the garbage that they produce from refining oil was sent to the backyards of the Southeast Side. And they were like several stories high, just piles of black dust. And, you know, I didn't really notice it at first because I've grown up seeing so many piles. If some of you took the expressway here, the Skyway, you could see like salt mounds. Sometimes they're blue. There's gravel. I mean, I don't even know what anything is, and I just am so desensitized to it. So, I mean, and it's also kind of comforting because that's what I grew up seeing and smelling metals and things like that. But, you know, when you become a parent, it's kind of not okay anymore.
And then right now, but there's also a current kind of like war against the manganese that's happening around here. Can you guys talk a little bit about that?
Just 2 blocks away from this beautiful gallery is this factory, SH Bell, and they handle this manganese, which is used to make steel. And it was actually picked up because we had air monitors installed from pet coke, and they were still on, and manganese started appearing on the air monitors in really high levels. And so activists here, you know, we're police watchdogs. I always like to say I have 3 jobs. I'm a full-time mom. I work downtown full-time, and then, you know, we're full-time agents here trying to call the EPA and our alderwoman all the time saying, hey, something smells really bad, or we're seeing things. But there's really high levels of manganese, and now they're in everyone's soil as well.
And what does it do?
So it can create Parkinson's-like symptoms and can cause developmental disabilities in children.
And so I think one of the things I'm thinking about is like even when we talk about environmental justice and environmental activism, right? Like even for like so many just like everyday people that are not fucking like logging on Facebook and like reading Vox or like some shit, it just sounds like what we think about is like, are you recycling, or like let's not use plastic, right? Like, but it actually like there are actually enemies like in the war of environmental justice. And so like who are you all like in the environmental movement over here, who are you all actually fighting against?
Well, I want to say essentially the city and the state, because if you target each facility here in the neighborhood, there's like 70, and you're just exhausting yourself, and you're
70
playing
what?
Industries, like of corporate factories here in the neighborhood. There's 8 landfills. There's so many handlers of manganese. So it's important to change land use and zoning rules to, prevent these industries from coming in. We need to be rezoned. And
I also don't like the way like manganese sounds like a French dessert. So like you kind of think it's like okay until you really think about it, and like you see shit popping off. It's like, would you like some manganese, right? Like it's fucked up.
It's really fucked up. The southeast side is a planned manufacturing district, so that means it's zoned for heavy industry, right? And so I also work in New York. They're called significant maritime industrial areas. They're the same. These are like waterfront communities primarily that are zoned for like especially heavy manufacturing use. And the challenges are very similar in that typically these are low-income communities of color, where the land has been devalued, right? Traditionally, you're seeing a lot of times there's an influx of manufacturing businesses that come to neighborhoods like these that are being displaced because of gentrification from other wealthier neighborhoods. And so you're even seeing that here on the southeast side where there's this flow of factories that are coming from like Lincoln Park, from the Kinsey Industrial Corridor, from other places north and are coming south. So it's this continuation of like, first it was the mills, and we didn't even think about environmental justice back then. We just took it because that was the jobs, right? And so now that's gone, and then there's still all of these other facilities that are here. They're still making people sick, and that's being compounded by this fact that the land value is increasing in other places. So we have more people that are coming in all the time, and so it's just this ongoing struggle to just fight for healthy air, to fight for clean water, to fight for your community. And what you'll hear next is like, and also with GINA too, is that there's this movement of women who are not settling, and men too, right? But are led by women that are not just sitting back and saying that this is okay. They're not accepting this anymore. And they're learning about new ideas. They're organizing their communities. They're learning about cooperative economies. They're learning about economic democracy, all of these terms. And I think that that's just so powerful. You're going to hear from a lot of them, and you're hearing from GINA now, but that's so impressive, for people in the community to decide that this is not their fate and to just change the direction and the outcome of the way that things are happening here is amazing.
So a lot of times in my experience, people kind of come late to environmental justice, right? They're politicized through environmentalism or through criminal justice, or immigrant justice. And the consciousness of how all those things are connected actually comes much later, if at all. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, like, what was your entry into this work, each of you, and did you come straight to the environmental justice movement, or was it another way of getting there?
In this community, there's like this story that's told about all the steel mills that when they were here, every time the workers would rise up and strike, that the company already had scouts going out all over the world where there was a port, where they could park a fucking ship, and where they could recruit men to come and break that fucking strike. So they were already ready for that shit. They knew that shit was gonna happen. That was part of the fucking plan. So then all these groups came to this neighborhood. People from Serbia, from Croatia, from Mexico, people from Mexico came on barges. My husband's grandfather came on a fucking barge. And they came in here as strike breakers. But sometimes those strike breakers joined the strike. It didn't work, right? Because they would start to work and they didn't have the equipment, they didn't have the training, they weren't able to do the work, and they're like, no, fuck this shit. We're gonna join the strike, and when we win, we all gonna have a job. For me, it was always like these two things, right? Like we have the steel mills, we need the work, and then those, right when I was born, is when all these steel mills started to close, I grew up. Me and Kate talk about this all the time, and Jay, well, we all do, about how our neighborhood was so sad. It was like so much depression, so much alcoholism, so much.
It still is.
It still is, right?
Come on, let's just be real.
Let's just be real. We still feel like, remember the good old days when there was work here. Mm-hmm. And my little sister's here, Katie Bautista, and she and Kate and other folks in the neighborhood started working to stop a coal gasification plant that was going to be right on the river, because Illinois has a shit ton of fucking coal, and they wanted something to do with it. So they were like, you know what? Why don't we take this fucking rock of coal
gasify
and
it.
fucking
Just
gasify
gasify
it
that
and use
shit.
10 million motherfucking gallons of water every fucking day to gasify this shit.
Dumb.
And then supply the power to the whole state of Illinois. So like this company was like, okay, we'll do this shit, but only if Illinois says that they're going to guarantee that the 4 utility companies are going to buy their gas from this company. So then they went and it passed. It fucking passed in Springfield. It passed in the House and it passed in the Senate. And then we found out in this neighborhood, and my sister and Kane, a bunch of people were like, fuck that shit. We're not going to gasify coal.
And this is right across the street from a high school
Right.
and an elementary
Is
school.
that George Washington?
And
Yes.
yes. So Washington High School, Washington Elementary School, and like the local grocery store and the TJ Maxx. Don't fuck with that.
The community fucking got organized like wildfire, okay? All the schools, like churches, people, like we had the Sierra Club was down here, Rising Tide was on here, Angie Vines is in the front
Hey,
row right
Angie.
here, helping us. Sean Estelle's here too from Rising Tide, who helped us. We'll talk about them in a minute because they're really important.
Or
to
you
the
could talk
story.
about me, but whatever.
But we'll talk about Ricky. So then what happened, like people wrote letters. We had like a campaign where we were writing postcards and little kids wrote, like drew like stories and pictures and sent all this shit to Governor Quinn, like tens of thousands of pieces of mail and faxes and all kinds of shit went to Governor Quinn, where he ended up vetoing this bill. So like that was one of our first victories.
You guys are living and organizing in the 10th ward, which went over 17% for Trump.
Yeah.
And there are precincts within this ward that were 30 or 40% for Trump. It's like, you know, you could see the Blue Lives Matter signs when you're driving around.
Oh my God.
Right?
don't give
But you're all advocating with a radical consciousness. So what's it like to So what's it like to navigate this more conservative landscape? Kate, I feel like you have something to say about this.
I do. So there's Hegwish. Let me talk about Hegwish, okay? It is a neighborhood, and I'm sorry if you live in Hegwish. Hopefully you, whatever. No, I'm not. I mean, hopefully you aren't one of them. So Hegwish is a little farther south, and there are a lot of cops that live in Hegwish, and just a lot of white people in general. And there are a lot of Blue Lives. My kid goes to his little preschool in Hegwish, and so when I drive him there, just on one street, I see like 5 to 6 on a block Blue Lives Matter signs. So this is the landscape that we are navigating, is that there's still a lot of very conservative white people who are working class. So I'm like, you're dumb. Why do you, what the fuck? It's outrageous to me that people in this ward still feel this way. I think there's a sentiment of like Steel Mill Town, USA, and that shit is over.
We still have time to change like hearts and minds around certain things, and I think we should always be trying, well, in a way that's still like not harming ourselves in doing so. I think that's the real fight in being like trying to create change, is trying to create change in your community and in the people you're around. And I also think it's interesting when we're talking about like violence in our neighborhoods around being an activist, and especially an activist of color, and how we do that in our organizing efforts, and how we both include and isolate people of color when we like only invite them to speak at events in ways that are tokenizing, or we create events where they're heavily policed for like the, you know, to get like the warrant or whatever to have land. It requires us calling the police to these events to create change. And it's like, who are we actually making environments for to like make this change, and who are we actually inviting to events, and how are we making the people we're inviting be like meaningful rather than tokenizing is something to always be thinking about.
What are some of the strategies and tactics that have worked for you all? Like, if you were writing a how-to guide for other environmental justice organizers, what would you all include?
I'm going to start that off, and I'm going to say include the youth. Include the young people. Listen to them. Their voice has merit. Their voice has wisdom. Their voice has hope. Include them. Listen to their ideas, because sometimes you need to be like, if you're the cynic, you need to hear that optimism. And every idea is valid and important.
When all the bureaucratic avenues have been expired, when we didn't have any more comment periods, when we had gone to City Hall and we're like, you know, this pet coke is not good for us, we need to get rid of it.
Forms.
What happened?
Right.
The next step was that we put our bodies on the line. We planned direct actions. There was Rising Tide came out really strong and helped us organize a direct action where we occupied the entrance to KCBX and we stopped work for a whole day. We came, you know, my job was to go to the alderman's office who was just recently elected to say like, hey, we are not gonna leave and we need you to tell the cops to, one, not fucking hurt us, and two, that we're not gonna leave until they arrest us. And they tried to talk us out of it. One semi-truck tried to, like, gunned it and, like, almost ran over people.
Yeah.
Um,
Remember?
and Kate was out there with her baby, like, chained up to other people, like, not letting them pass. Because this system, these bureaucratic measures, are only going to take you so far. And if you don't have the political will, the people in office that are going to take those risks, then we're fucked. The situation is not going to change,
Right.
and we're not going to change our our mind. We're going to do what we have to do until it gets better. Because for us, it is fucking life and death.
Let's give it up for our featured guests this evening, Olga, Kate, Kat, and Jade. For tonight's Got You Last, tonight's show was entitled Environmental Revolution and the Momme Fatales of South Chicago. Karl Marx famously said, right? Karl Marx famously said, men make history, but not through circumstances of their choosing. But here on the far southeast side of Chicago, it is women, many of them moms, in fact, that have been making history as they lead the charge against circumstances of corporate environmental abuse bolstered by political collusion that were definitely not of their choosing. But they answered the call to fight against them for themselves, their families, their communities, and the planet. While now might be a cute moment to say some shit like the future is female, I will not. Because the reality is the future is fucking endangered.
Yeah.
Last month, a UN report on the state of the environment forecast climate genocide in 12 years. The fact that only 100 corporations are behind 71% of global emissions and that the corporate fabricated situations of manganese and pet coke we discussed tonight are happening in these working class communities of color and not on the doorsteps of the global executive elite reflects what we already know, that those responsible for climate change will be insulated from the crisis it creates while its deadly effects will be unevenly distributed amongst poor people and people of color or a racialized planetary precariat. Since we cannot count on our governments and representatives who so often enable this environmental abuse, it is important that we look at the work of Angela, Gina, Jade, Kate, Olga, and Kat, and their comrades here to have an example of the kind of activism we might need to offset this haunting future. This is an activism that is not about individualist action led by celebrity activists or some messianic male figure. It is a collective activism. It is not an activism for the gram or media spectacle happening in this moment of woke culture, the performance of politics, and when being an activist is a fetishized identity. It is an activism that is grassroots, happening because it had to and sustained by the incorporation of fighting for change as part of daily fucking life.
Right.
It is an activism that has been triumphant, and yes, it is female. And by being female, it looks different. At the risk of gender essentializing, I will say part of what impresses me so much about the activists and activism spotlighted tonight is how it is intergenerational and includes the political education of their daughters and children. One of the first times I met some of our guests tonight was at an event for Amara, as I talked about. And what moves me most is that it is an activism that is rooted in that type of care that I described that happened there. It is an activism that is rooted in care for each other. 2 weeks ago, when Olga, Gina, and Kate came over for dinner to prepare for this show, I remember Olga saying, after several bottles of wine,
Oh shit! What'd I say?
I was on the phone with Kate in the shower, and we were talking about how we're all fucked up from all the shit that happened to us all our lives, and how sometimes that makes its way into the work sometimes. I'm sure it does, but already...
Sometimes. It happens sometimes. Sometimes that happens sometimes.
I'm sure it does. But already in the 3 months since I've met these women, all I have seen is how much they love to drink and love each other.
That shit is correct.
And how they care for each other and how that is also part of their activism. Really embodying the
Salud.
feminist. Right.
There's wine in my Polar Express cup because I'm a mom. I went to Polar Express.
They really embody the feminist maxim, the personal is political. And I want to add that they teach us the personal is political is planetary.
Yes.
And that the change we need, right? I thought about that too. I was like, we're so connected.
I'm gonna make stickers. We need buttons.
And that the change we need is possible. And I want to thank the intersectional environmental activism of the Momme Fatales and the Femme Fatales of Southeast Chicago for showing us how it might happen. Let's give it up for our featured guest this evening.
Salud. Salud.
Wait for this moment. If it's not